Now to introduce our speaker, Keenan Ganz is a third-year PhD student in the Remote Sensing and Geospatial Analysis lab at the University of Washington. He uses remote sensing to study how forests respond to drought and thermal stress. And prior to coming to UW, Keenan worked as a GIS consultant and at Oak Ridge National Laboratory's Environmental Science Division. Keenan will take questions after the talk, and thank you everybody for showing up. And with that, I'll hand it over to you, Keenan.
Thanks
About your research.
Yeah, thank you everybody for being here. I know it's a really nice day outside, and I appreciate you taking some time to listen to me talk about forecasting drought and insect-induced forest mortality. Spoiler alert, we're going towards deep learning with this, and I'm not assuming any kind of backgrounds with any of those techniques. We'll kind of build up to that stuff, but if you're kind of an expert on that sort of thing, I'm afraid you might be a little bit bored until the very end when we get to that part, but stick with me. So today, I have a few things that I want to accomplish. I want to impart on you why predicting tree mortality is important, what exactly makes this problem interesting from a research and from a statistical perspective, and I want to give you some practical concerns that you might apply in similar geoscience problems. So with that, how do you kill a tree? Of course, you might be thinking like an axe and a saw, but we're thinking more of like environmental stressors. And there's three key mechanisms that at least I think about. The first is hydraulic failure. You can think of a tree like a bundle of bendy straws. The bendy straws in the center carry water upward, and the bendy straws on the outside carry sugars and nutrients from the leaves downward, kind of throughout the rest of the organs of the tree. That water is always under tension. There is literal pressure that is constantly sucking water upward. When the air is very dry, that pressure becomes much stronger, and it can become so strong that it fills some of those pipe-like tissues with air. We call that embolism, and that's a really big deal for vascular plants like trees because now those tissues can't carry water anymore. If this becomes extremely pervasive, then the tree can no longer carry water throughout all its vital organs, and, well, it dies. We call that process hydraulic failure. Another more kind of short-term process that can kill a tree is heat stress. Who was here during the heat dome in 2021? I was here. Really bad day. It was a bad day for the trees too. This was on the coastal range of Oregon. I'm not sure how well you can see here, but there's all sorts of browning kind of through here. And it's almost exclusively on the west side of all these ridge lines here. Why the west side? Any idea?
Range.
Afternoon. So on this particular day, like in the morning, the sun was on the eastern part of the sky, all sort of surface water and like water stored within some of these trees evaporated out. Then by the afternoon, sun moves over to the west side, and it got so darn hot that it literally cooked a lot of the leaves in this forest that we're looking at here. And then this last one, this big one, is insects that literally burrow into trees and destroy their internal tissue. There's a lot of complexity in this process. There's all sorts of very specific relationships between an attacking insect and a host tree. Sometimes the insect only goes after trees of a certain size. So there's lots of complexity here. And that complexity is compounded by the fact that all these mechanisms interact. The drought stress that partially embolizes a tree can make a beetle attack it could otherwise survive become fatal. So this makes predicting mortality really, really hard, both at the individual tree level as well as at the landscape scale. Fortunately, there was this really cool paper called "Why is Tree Drought Mortality So Hard to Predict?" that can tell us why some other reasons why this is hard. I really like this conceptual figure where if we think about the relative likelihood of mortality among different tree species, we can think about their hydraulic traits. How aggressively do they use water? Things like hydraulic safety margin, minimum stomatal conductance, all these different things if you're a plant physiologist. And then as soon as we actually step out onto a landscape, we take those nice and neat bell curves and we smear them. We smear them within population variation in stress, covariation in traits, as well as variability among biotic mortality agents. So all this takes kind of any understanding we may have at the species level of what exactly predisposes a tree to mortality, and it adds a whole bunch of confounding variables on top of it. This makes mortality a nonlinear and time-lagged problem, so it's a very challenging phenomenon to predict. Nonetheless, we strive on, we try to predict it anyway, and we have at least two objectives that we can think about in terms of forecasting future tree mortality. First, we can ask ourselves, where will mortality occur next? In cases where we have really big sort of stand-level mortality events, those areas become really susceptible to destructive fire. They're also an opportunity for salvage logging and bioenergy production. So if we can know where those are going to happen in the future, that benefits managers. We can have more efficient allocation of resources, so on and so forth. And then if we accomplish that first objective, we can do the second one, is we can interpret whatever forecasting model we come up with to ask then, why does mortality occur where it does? I've spoken about this project with Washington Department of Natural Resources, and the second objective is actually the more popular one I hear about among managers, because it lets us probe like 50 years into the future. As climate change continues, what's really going to be pushing for us over the edge, and where is that going to be a really particular problem? So if we want to accomplish these objectives, if we want to do any kind of modeling of this phenomenon, we need data. And so the next question then is, how do we measure tree mortality? Might ponder that for just a second, and you may be surprised to hear that at least in the United States, as of today, the best data set we have available for measurements of tree mortality is people flying around in planes with iPads. This is genuinely probably my favorite data set in existence. It's called the Aerial Detection Survey Program. It's run by the US Forest Service. It is about as high tech as you see in this picture. People go out with GPS-enabled iPads, they fly around all the forests in the US, and they draw little bubbles around the places where the trees are dead. They might add to that the relative severity of that mortality, like what proportion of trees are affected, as well as the damage-causing agent. They might try and guess based off what trees are there, like what insect was responsible for it, whether it was a landslide. There's at least one instance where they attributed mortality to a bear, which I would have loved to have seen that, but alas. So every year we get this big old database full of polygons drawn all over the landscape with some of these attributes. Generally, when we do machine learning with geoscience data, we want to live in image space. It's a lot easier to do this sort of thing if your data is an image. So I wanted to first convert all these polygons to images. This is the process for this. The ADS program gives us an approximate kind of buffer zone where they consider the survey to have happened. That's just kind of how far they look out along the plane. And then within that, we have all the damage polygons. This then gives us a kind of natural way that we can burn those into a raster of a particular resolution. The color scale here is severity. So you can imagine we weight the burning process to have higher values where those polygons are indicating higher severity. Now the eagle-eyed among you might notice, hey, wait a second, Keenan, some of the pixels in here don't really match kind of what's going on over there. That's because there's some other cleanup that goes into this, masking out non-forested pixels and that sort of thing. So we can stand up this workflow pretty easily. But then you might notice there's a bunch of problems the longer we look at this data set. And the first is that these surveys show spatial bias. This red line is where the plane flew in this particular year of surveying. And it very neatly subdivides all these damaged polygons into different rows. I'm pretty sure the bark beetles are not self-organizing themselves into discrete like rows of attack. So this probably isn't a real phenomenon. That's something that's arising from just the way in which these data are collected. Moreover, these distribution of the survey polygons we have show spatial bias. If you imagine an observer looking out from the window of an airplane, it's hard to look far away, and it's hard to look straight below you, but it's hard to look a little bit further out, a little bit away from the plane. That's exactly what we observe, where there is more mortality recorded about 1 kilometer away from the plane's flight line. This 3,000 kilometer, I'm kind of doing a hard cutoff here because that's the approximate buffer zone they use to define the survey area. So we're aware of this severity, or we're aware of this bias. Can we do anything about it? Unfortunately, no, because the ADS program is not exactly consistent in their record keeping. Sometimes the flight lines don't really align with the survey area at all. This was California, and I want to say 2016. all this up here looks like pretty closely aligned, and then there's weird stuff going on down here. But because the Forest Service runs this program in kind of a federated way, each region of the US kind of coordinates their own thing and distributes their data in a different way, most of the US doesn't publish the flight lines. We only get the survey area. So then we kind of can't do any correction to this to account for the spatial bias. So all we can really do is just kind of accept that. At least like for now. I'm only just going to accept it for the results I'm showing you here. There's another inconsistency in that that severity attribute that I mentioned earlier. Some regions just don't record that. Sometimes it'll be recorded in some of the data, but then be missing in the other half. I don't really see a rhyme or reason to it. This is kind of a discontinuity. You see the California region of the Forest Service is a different one from the Oregon region. And in 2016, the Californians were just super on it and they recorded all their severity. And then up in Oregon and the rest of the Pacific Northwest, they didn't record severity at all. This is a bit of a problem if I want to do my polygon burning process is like, well, how much do I weight these polygons relative to this one? I also want to show you kind of what exactly is happening in all these polygons as well, because you might be a little bit surprised over what exactly they record as damage. So this is an example polygon from the eastern part of Washington, kind of like the eastern edge of the Cascades. And the imagery I'm showing you below this was captured the same year as the aerial detection surveyors went out with it. Its imagery was captured maybe 2 weeks after the ADS plane flew. Y'all see any dead trees in there? Might be a little bit hard to see up here. It's really hard to tell, isn't it? You might be thinking like down here, that's just bare ground. But trust me, they're in there. Very small pockets of them. The way this program works is that sometimes the observers will draw a nice tight little circle around that pocket of damage, or they'll say, no, I think there's a pattern there, and they'll kind of draw a generalized outline over where all those different patches are. So the severity attribute is extremely important, especially when we compare very low level severity down over here. That's really dark and hard to see, but trust me, there's not a lot of dead trees there. Whereas in here, I mean, by my eye, like half the trees are dead in this picture. That's something that we really want to capture. We should not be weighting these two polygons the same in any kind of forecasting or modeling of this phenomenon. But I'm not done yet. There is yet another problem, which is that observers are inconsistent. If I map out just like the area of each rasterized pixel that is covered by mortality polygons, and I just plot out how those time series look for a couple of pixels, and these are just arbitrary locations that I just picked out, this is a really spiky data set. And from my understanding of ecology, I think it's pretty unlikely that 80% of the trees were dead in 1 year, and then none of them were dead the next year. That doesn't seem right to me. You'll notice there's some missingness through here as well. That results just from the plane doesn't fly in the same place every year. And so sometimes you miss data. In 2020, it flew almost nowhere. And so there's, pretty much everything is missing for that particular year. So suffice to say, we have to do a lot of cleanup before we can really do anything with this data set. I used a couple steps. I'm just going to run through them. Throw out all the polygons that correspond to single trees. We only care about stand level mortality, so those small ones we don't really care about. We're going to isolate this data set down to damage that was either attributed to an insect or droughts. We don't care about the bears. We don't care about landslides. We don't care about wind throw. And then we'll also gap fill severity with the annual geometric mean. So if in a particular year nationwide mortality was something like, I don't know, 10% severity, we'll just have to shrug our shoulders and gap fill the rest of the polygons with that value, just so that we can have some kind of weighting to go off of. And this last step turned out to be quite important, which was we have to smooth these mortality signals over time. And the particular algorithm that I found very effective for this was a backwards exponentially weighted moving average. You can look up kind of exactly what that does, but the nice thing about it is that, for example, if we look at this spike over here, and the smooth signal information doesn't leak backward, we aren't making it any easier for the model to kind of pick up when an event is about to happen, because the spike always happens at the same time. But there is information leakage forward that kind of reduces the spikiness of the data set and maybe makes it a little bit more realistic to what is likely happening on the ground. there isn't a whole lot of on-the-ground observation for a lot of these things. So yes, I am making some assumptions here, but suffice to say, we'll see kind of what this choice does to model performance. I have some sensitivity analysis of that I'm excited to show. Okay, so we have a data set. One detail I'm leaving out here is that I also aligned a bunch of covariates with this, think like annual climate, elevation, burned area, forest density, all sorts of things that we know from the literature are, do have some empirical relationship with mortality severity in forests. So now we can think about models and how we're going to set up training for this. Just to be absolutely clear kind of about the prediction task that we're doing here, given past mortality severity as well as covariates for some period of time looking backward, so from, say t minus 3 up till t, predicts what mortality will be at t plus 1. T here is in cadence of years because that matches kind of the cadence of the survey program. So that's the prediction task. Another detail I'd like to harp on is how we can set these models up to generalize them in space and time. Think about what we're working towards here from like an operational perspective. I'd be really happy if this project turned into like an annual map that maybe comes out in like February or March of where we think mortality is going to happen the next summer. If I'm training a model to do that, it should generalize well in time. So those of you that maybe have done machine learning, you've heard of like a training and a validation set. When we are validating our model after training, we should see how it performs by generalizing across time. In terms of space, I'm pretty okay with just having this forecast operate in the same locations year after year. Say like I only care about the Western US. I'm not going to take this and apply it to like, I don't know, New York or something. In that case, we don't really care about splitting up training and validation data by space. We only really care about doing it in time. And so this is kind of the setup we came up with. I'm not sure how well some of you were able to see that table, but suffice to say, pick out like a 8 to 10 year period for each one of these folds, and you end up with several million pixels for each one of these folds, which is absolutely plenty of data to work with for the sort of thing that we're doing. So we know our prediction tasks. We know how we're stratifying the data for training, validation, and testing. Next thing to talk about is naivety. This is a step that I see left out from a lot of machine learning papers. It's important to ask yourself how your models do compared to if you just did no machine learning whatsoever. And in this case, again, from an operational perspective, we can think of at least two naive models. Last observation, which is just our prediction at t plus 1, is identical to our observation at t. We assume nothing changes from year to year. Then also a pixel average, which is that our prediction at t plus 1 is the running mean of all observations at that location up to t. So you can imagine, like, again, in an operational setting, as we accumulate more information about a location, we kind of just revise our risk map in that way. Just to visualize how those two naive models look, for one arbitrary pixel, blue, the original signal, the observed mortality severity based off ADS. Orange, last observation, you can see it's just the blue signal but shifted over one. And then pixel average is this kind of neat little smooth, where just as time goes on, it tends to converge towards the overall mean of the data up to that point. So how do these do? I'm going to be using two metrics to quantify model performance here, R squared and RMSE. R squared is neat because it ranges from 0 to 1, and it's kind of a level playing field you can talk about different studies on. For various reasons, it is not a great measure for comparing models, though. R squared is more sensitive to outliers, and so if you're using it to kind of pick between models, it's better to lean towards something like root mean square error. So I'm going to be using both of those, but as far as like if you're wanting to, pick a winner and set up a leaderboard, RMSE is generally a better choice. So how do these two do? Pretty darn well. Without doing any machine learning whatsoever, you can explain half the variance in mortality. Not bad. And you might be saying to yourself, I just want to clarify like scale over here. This is a true like percent pixel area. So this like 0.38, that's not 38%. That is truly 0.38% of a pixel. So pretty precise in terms of like an estimate of the area of a pixel that's going to be affected by mortality. Okay, so we have some naive models. Next step, let's look at the literature. Let's see what people have done. Yeah.
With a very naive question.
Yes.
If you fly over an area and a tree is dead.
Yes.
You fly over it next year, surely it's still dead. And the next year it'll still be dead and its generation will fall down.
Yes.
So why shouldn't you expect it just to be the same every year, except there'll be some new dead trees maybe, or you're only measuring new dead trees?
Yeah, so because of the inconsistency among observers, as well as the inconsistent survey area of ADS, it's very challenging to separate new mortality from old mortality. There definitely is kind of a lag from when mortality is first observed to when we can say that area has recovered. I'm not really accounting for that here, and that's probably a very big reason why that pixel average performs so well. I'll mention I did some experiments where, and I don't really have the results to show from them here, where instead of predicting like the area from year to year, predicting the delta from year to year. When we get to the conclusions kind of with the more advanced models, please remind me if I don't mention it, but we'll come back to that question. So what have people in the literature done? Well, random forest and generalized additive models. This is kind of like, you know, if you have an arbitrary data set, these two model architectures work really, really well, and are a pretty solid baseline for how well you can expect to perform, assuming you do, you know, you aren't doing deep learning or some other, you know, more complex thing with that. These are some of the covariates that we have. I just want to emphasize that there's no information from the future available to these models. Every time they make a prediction for t+1, the only data provided is up until t, maybe looking back some period of time, but there's no information from the future. And when we run these, they don't do that much better than naivety. There's a lot of published work out there that fit random forest and GAMS to mortality data and then used model explanation tools like partial dependence plots or SHAP to kind of piece together the underlying ecology. So this result is a little bit unsettling to me, because then if we look back at some of those papers and it turns out that maybe these models aren't actually doing that much prediction, it may turn out that these relationships that we're identifying here, these nice curves about burned area and precipitation, that may actually confirm some of our ecological intuition, these may actually be spurious relationships. You can run SHAP and partial dependence plots all you want on models that add no predictive power, but you aren't likely to actually learn anything about the underlying phenomenon if you do so. Okay, so we have a baseline for how well these things perform. We know what naivety is. We know kind of what the best of classical machine learning will give us. Let's start doing deep learning with this. I'm assuming no background with deep learning in this room or for anyone on Zoom. So just briefly, I'll mention that training a deep learning model is fundamentally different from how we might do classical machine learning. It's not a magic spell, but there are some differences that affect how we handle the data. First, deep learning, at least based off the literature, seems to only do better when data exhibits autocorrelation either within space or in time. That's kind of the value add that these more complex architectures give you. I explicitly made temporal autocorrelation in this data, and I could show you from the surveys that there is spatial autocorrelation. So check, there's maybe structure there that a deep learning model is uniquely suited to capture. Training these models is also fundamentally different. Instead of maybe with classical statistics, you pass your whole data set in, you do kind of in one shot, identify your parameters, and you're done. Whereas with deep learning, the model at any one time during training only actually sees a very small piece of data. I had many millions of pixels kind of in my entire data set. At each sort of iteration in this process, the model's only seeing maybe a couple hundred pixels at a time. And it just ever so slightly tweaks its predictions to do a little bit better. You repeat that many thousands of times until you're satisfied with how the model is performing, usually by comparing it to a validation set. I'm not really going to talk about learning curves and overfitting today, but it's out there if you want to learn about it. This difference means that there's some very practical differences between doing model training with classical ML and with deep learning. The first problem that I really had to grapple with was finding valid image windows. Imagery on your computer is kind of always stored in this contiguous sense, where within this red box showing the extent of this data set, all that data is kind of adjacent to each other in memory. It's very easy to just kind of take some scissors and clip out a little patch as long as that patch is contiguous within itself. If I'm training a model, though, I don't really care about this great empty nothingness where I don't have data. There's nothing there where I can really learn from, right? So like, why even look at that? What we want to do is extract small windows of this data. In my case, I did 8 by 8 in space and then 5 time steps, and then work on those little chips. They're called chips or patches, things like that. So the first task is, all right, given this large contiguous block of data, slice out all the individual pieces. Because this data is so sparse, or actually I should mention, there's at least 2 strategies we can think of for accomplishing this task. First, you can calculate all the positions where you have valid data and then just iterate over that list of positions as you're training your model. Or you can iterate through the data set until you find a valid window, pass it to your model, and then continue iterating. If you look online at tutorials for doing machine learning with geoscience data, they'll often tell you to do the second one, of just iterate over until you find a valid window and then keep on going. One of the things I learned from this project is that actually pre-calculating valid positions is much faster when data are sparse. And training time is tends to be a really big deal with deep learning projects because that's when you're spending lots of money on GPU time. So we want things to be really, really fast. That bar is all the 8 by 8 by 5 windows I have in my data set. That orange little sliver are all the ones that are at least 90% all the way there. So you can imagine if I'm just randomly taking windows out of that big blue bar, it's going to be a long time before I find one I can actually use. That wastes a lot of time. If I compare the amount of time it takes to generate a patch, note the log scale along here, is really, really big difference. And to quantify that, suppose you save like 10 milliseconds every time you have to generate a new window. For a typical training loop that looks like this, that means you save just about 48 minutes of time in just accessing your data. This also implies then an easy way to decide between which strategy works for you. If it takes you less than 48 minutes to iterate over your data set and calculate all the positions where you have valid data, then pre-calculating indices is faster. Otherwise, this random access approach is faster. Another thing to consider is the order in which data are passed to the model. This becomes a really big problem when data are autocorrelated. So I'm going to briefly show you some results. This is only California. We started out just only looking at California. Just, start small, makes things easy. And I have 3 data sets here that are ordered in distinct ways. These points are all colored by kind of their order in the data set. That really dark purple means that that pixel is seen earlier. Further along you go, that pixel is seen later. The way data are kind of supplied to you by default, at least in most data structures, is with no shuffling. Everything is sequential. If you iterate sequentially over an image, you'll kind of, walk in a very predefined pattern. Data that are cloud optimized in things like Dask arrays or ZAR or any kind of, those more modern structures, they might be ordered as chunks where within each one of these squares, data are sequential, but you can access the chunks in any random order you want. And then if your data fit entirely into memory, you can scramble it into whatever order you want, and it just kind of looks all over the place like that. Because of the way I plotted this, it shows all the yellow pixels on top. Don't worry, there's all the other colors in there too. They're just kind of underneath. You can, I don't know, throw a tomato at me for making that plot bad. I apologize. And it turns out that if you train, in this case, a simple fully connected neural network with the exact same parameters, in the exact same fashion, only changing the order of the data, you get wildly different results. When we're talking about training deep learning models, you can think of epoch as kind of like number of laps that you've gone through the data, continually updating itself. And we track the RMSE on the validation set because that's the data we haven't seen or that the model does not see during training. So this is the way that you can monitor kind of the progress of your training. Once the model kind of reaches a plateau on the validation set, that's when you can stop and say, okay, I'm not getting any better. If you do no shuffling whatsoever, you get garbage. If you do chunk shuffling, you do a little bit better, but you don't do quite as well as full shuffling. This is because if your data are autocorrelated, so that is when they're similar in space and time, and you walk sequentially over them, the model will see during training for brief periods of time very similar patches all at once, and it'll adjust. It'll sort of bias itself towards whatever trend is in that position of your data set. And then it'll go to a new region with a slightly different pattern, and it'll bias itself towards that, as opposed to identifying patterns that generalize well across the entire data set you're looking at. So suffice to say, shuffle your data.
How you do the full shuffling of a spatial data set?
Full shuffling of a spatial data set is the order in which that data is accessed is unrelated to its position. So it's like I pull a window from here, then here, then here, then here, then here. Like it's just random, randomly ordered in that sense. Yeah. Lastly, I want to have just a brief aside about pixel size. You may have heard that I mentioned my pixels are 4 kilometers kind of at the beginning of this. And you might have been asking yourself, well, gee, why'd you pick that? That seems like it came out of nowhere. Originally, I was going to operate at 1 kilometer, but it turns out that at that particular scale, you run into all sorts of problems with having to store data on the cloud. It doesn't fit into memory. You have to think about a chunking strategy. You need parallelism. All these sorts of hard problems that are completely unrelated to making your model perform well. And so then one day I kind of went back to the folks I've been talking with at DNR about this project, and I was like, hey, if I made you a map of this phenomenon, do you care if the pixels are this big or this big? And they said, yeah, you can make it a little bit coarser and that's fine. And that made all the difference, because then your data fits into memory and all those problems just evaporate. This was an important thing to consider, though, because it means that we can iterate much faster on model development, confident that the results of our research will still be beneficial to their users. So especially if you're doing or if you're doing work that has a management application, talk to the end users. It might actually make your work a lot easier if you know what kind of product they're looking for. Okay, so let's talk about now the actual deep learning that I've done in this project. And for this, we're using an architecture called a convolutional long short-term memory network. I'm not going to get into the full definition of how this thing works, but I'm going to tell you about 2 properties that make it extremely well suited to this sort of problem. The first is convolution, which is that as the model generates predictions, adjacent pixels, a pixel in the output is informed by spatially close by pixels in the input. This means that the model can learn spatial relationships. Second property is recurrence, which is that the model will maintain an internal sort of hidden state about the phenomenon you are trying to model, and will update that hidden state at each time step. This allows it to learn how different time steps are related. The original paper that proposed the convolutional LSTM architecture applied it to actually forecasting precipitation, which is a problem, very similar in a lot of ways to forecasting mortality. And there's actually a lot of evidence that this architecture performs well on geoscience problems in general. So we have good reason to be optimistic that it'll be beneficial here. If you're a deep learning person, these are all the specs of how everything was set up. Cool. How to do?
I have a question.
Yeah.
So many different options for what things you can tweak and so on. How do you know which of these things to use? Is it just a matter of trial and error?
It's trial and error. I kind of in the directory where I have all the scripts and data for this, I have a folder called logs, which is just the results of every time I've run a model. I think I have about 100 variations on all of that in there. The one thing to consider, though, is that you can kind of estimate sensitivity of these things. Like if I run dropout, if I do a run at 5% dropout and then another one at 30%, and I get more or less the same result, then yeah, I probably don't need to mess with dropout that much. But then you might be asking yourself, well, what if the effectiveness of dropout is contingent upon how many layers you have? And yeah, the parameter space gets really large. fully exploring that parameter space is still like kind of an open problem in deep learning of like, what's the best way to do that? Or even, is there a better way than just trial and error?
And you're comparing the parameters space on the validation set, or do you go all the way to testing set?
Both. I mean, it's easy enough to run it on both the validation set and the test set. I should mention all the results I'm showing, like here, this is all on the validation set. I didn't mention that, but that's important, so you should know it. And oh no, the convolutional LSTM isn't doing any better than the naive models either. Well, darn it. It'd be nice to know, though, what exactly is happening with these predictions. And to do that, I kind of went in QGIS and just kind of arbitrarily drew some blobs that correspond to ecoregions. There's also some national forests in all these places. These are arbitrary areas. I just didn't want to look at single pixels because of all the noise that is kind of in this data set. And if I compare like true mortality rate to the predicted model rate, we get some time series that look like this. You might say to yourself, like, well, on the face of it, that doesn't look too bad. Like, it's following it reasonably closely. But I would like to direct your attention to kind of the rightmost part of this interior northwest time series. When there's a big spike here, the model doesn't detect it, but it shoots up the next year. This makes me think that the convolutional LSTM has gone, or that training process has gone through immense effort to essentially recreate the last observation version of that naive model. That's actually really common for that long short-term memory architecture for when a data set is particularly challenging. So one question I have is to come back to the smoothing question. This is kind of a conceptual diagram of what I might be hypothesizing is happening here. Is, well, did I kind of taint my data by smoothing it over time? It might be that for the raw data, predicting like a true ecological pattern, like identifying the relationship between fire and precipitation and mortality and all these other things, does only a little bit better than the naive guess, just because of the difficulty of this problem. But then by smoothing the data, I'm really incentivizing naivety as opposed to doing the true ecology. So what I did is I took all the experiments I've shown you so far and I reran all of them on the raw data. And I compared how the models were ranked, or all these different architectures were ranked by RMSE between those two runs. And almost nothing changed. If anything, the LSTM did better on the raw data than on the smoothed data. So this tells us that smoothing probably isn't to blame, because we come to really similar conclusions regardless of whether we include that step. So now what? We know that current models aren't outperforming naive baselines. We know that throwing increasingly complex architectures isn't improving performance. For those of you that really kind of follow this literature quite closely, there was a big geoscience foundation model that was released last week. Foundation models are these really fancy, like ChatGPT, for example, is kind of like a foundation model, which is that something trained on just an absurd amount of data, such that you can have any arbitrary data set you want, throw it at it, and you might get good results. I tried passing some of this mortality stuff to a foundation model, and that didn't do any better either. It did do better than random forest, though, which I thought was pretty funny. Suffice to say, throwing the most complex architecture probably in existence in the world right now didn't improve anything. So probably increasing, like, our lack of predictive power here probably isn't due to architecture. And it seems like smoothing isn't really hurting it either. A kind of truism for deep learning projects is that, I first heard this espoused by, in a course at UC Berkeley called Full Stack Deep Learning. It's all kind of public online. You can watch all the lectures. But one line from it really stuck out to me, which is that researchers think about algorithms, engineers think about data. And all this time I've been kind of thinking about different algorithmic approaches, different architecture-based approaches, but it really may just come down to the data we're working with. And if you go to the literal law that authorizes the ADS program to exist, you'll see that their purpose is to conduct surveys to detect and appraise insect infestations and disease conditions, not to support machine learning. Of course, like, duh, like that's obvious. They've been doing it since the 90s, like before machine learning was really popular or even like seriously considered as a way to do environmental management. But suffice to say, the goal of all the people flying around in the planes isn't to generate a balanced data set of positive and negative cases to identify change. It's to find all the places where there's dead trees. And then to think about how that impacts like the timber resources of the United States in terms of like national security and that sort of thing. So we have to go back to the data and think about how can we turn this into something that's a little bit more amenable for the modeling that we want to do. One idea is to try to predict one insect instead of all of them all at once. Like I mentioned at the beginning, there's a lot of complexity in what insects attack certain trees. The pinyon ips, for example, goes after like 3 different species of tree, whereas the western pine beetle goes after like 30. There's absolutely, well, I shouldn't say absolutely, most likely kind of a different ecology that's going on there that governs whether or not these different species have outbreaks. And if you track them over time, you can see that when there's a big spike in mortality, it's usually due to just one insect. So maybe we can increase the signal to noise ratio of this data by focusing in on just one insect species. I don't have any results to show from that yet. This is just like Quo Vadis, like, future work. Another idea is that we want to really hone in on only the super, severe, fields of brown, high severity mortality events. And just because of all the issues that I've identified with the ADS polygons, we might have to just look at imagery in order to do that, like do a pre and post NDVI or DRNBR, whatever the fire index that all those fire people use is, to be able to confirm to ourselves that these polygons are not just like low severity background mortality, but the really severe events that we're trying to capture and forecast in this project. So with that, thank you for your attention. I'm happy to take any questions. I'll mention that all the code I have for this is open source. If you want to collaborate on this, I've been really kind of going at it solo for a while. So if you want to jump into this, I'd love to have another pair of eyes to think about this. One org I'd really like to shout out is CryoCloud. They're part of a collaboration that's based out of connected to UW through the eScience Institute, but they've been providing all sorts of computational resources to me for free, kind of on this entire project. So if you're thinking of doing machine learning with geoscience data and you want to get a head start in terms of resources, that's a really cool organization to know. Yeah, thank you for your attention. Happy to take questions. Yeah, go for it, Helen.
Okay, so you said like kind of one of their main goals was to like get some understanding as to like why mortality happens. Assuming you're able to like train a deep learning model that is useful, like how do you get, like, is there some sort of variable importance or something that you can get out of that?
Yeah. So the question was for people on Zoom. Assume you have a good model, how do you then assess why mortality happens? For deep learning models, there has been a lot of progress in the past couple of years of doing explanation on kind of where their predictions come from. That's been a common criticism, is that they're kind of a black box kind of model. We have tools like SHAP to do that, which is Shapley additive explanations. There's some tools out there to do that very efficiently for deep learning models. Really, like the kind of like product I would produce is hold kind of all the year-to-year covariates constant. So like disregard the effect of like weather or like burned area or any of those things. And just look at like the intrinsic site characteristics that are governing mortality. Because like the weather's going to change, fire behavior is going to change. If we're thinking about the future, that might just be something that we can't forecast. But if we know just intrinsically based off things like elevation, slope, aspect, where mortality is happening, that's something that's more useful, I would argue, from a like future adaptation perspective.
We had a question online. So given all the biases and inconsistencies in the severity dimension of the ADS data, have you considered looking at just a binary detection / non-detection response instead?
Yes, that was actually the first approach I did with this. I don't have the data to show you here, but suffice to say, I hope it suffices to say that the conclusions that I've described to you here don't really change that much when you turn this into a binary classification problem instead of a regression problem. If anything, because even with all the bias in that severity attribute, we can still pretty reliably distinguish between 0 and non-zero, all biases maintained. So in my experience, converting it to a classification problem actually makes it harder because you're taking away what little signal there is in that severity attribute. The real improvement, I would argue, on top of the ADS program would be to just segment out all the dead trees individually from high resolution satellite imagery. Work on that is actually ongoing. There's some Proxima KC is someone who just graduated out of my lab, that a couple chapter 2 in their dissertation directed to exactly that. There's also some folks in Germany that have made some really great progress on identifying dead trees from imagery. That'd really be kind of the holy grail kind of data to do this work on, because it wouldn't be subject to human bias or where they fly the plane or what angle are they looking at out of the window. The real challenge with that is that it's really hard to process like all the sentinel imagery for a year for the entire Western US. But I think we're maybe like 6 months to a year from a data set like that being like really, really feasible. There's some cool preprints coming out now in that area. Yeah.
Thank you. Nice talk. I was wondering, so you mentioned burning a couple of times, but how do you factor in the mortality that comes from burning as something that is supposedly going to increase with climate change, right? Because I remember you mentioned mortality from drought and from disease or insects and all that. So like how, if you have a big patch that burns, and then probably that's going to stay burned for quite a few years until stuff goes back up. So is that confounding at all on your data, and how do you take that into account for projection?
Yeah, so the way I take that into account is the ADS surveyors, they'll draw like polygons around a burn patch, mark it as burned, and then I can just throw those polygons out. Mainly because like if forecasting mortality is hard, try forecasting fire a year out. Like that's even harder. And so, yeah, I'm just kind of considering forecasting fire-related mortality out of scope for this particular project. If someone can forecast at like 1 kilometer resolution where all the fires will be a year in advance, like good for them. That person's not me.
Work for insurance.
Yeah, they'll probably work for an insurance company or a hedge fund. They'll be very well compensated for their time.
Isn't that what happened with Palisades fires, where the insurance companies dropped all those houses the year before the fires hit? They're like, we're not going to insure you, like the ones down in LA.
I don't know the particular details of that. And
places where the insurance companies like, no, you're uninsurable, we're not going to insure this area.
Yeah, I think that I don't think that the insurance companies knew a fire was going to happen and they didn't tell anyone.
No, they probably didn't set the fire.
Yeah.
But they just assessed that some areas were super high risk and not insurable.
Yeah, and that's kind of a trend that's continuing, especially in California. Is like we're seeing a lot of insurers just refusing to provide homeowner insurance to people. But, yeah.
So earlier you were splitting the data set into your training, validation, testing.
Yeah.
You had consecutive years.
Yes.
For all of those. Is there a reason you did that as opposed to like arbitrarily picking years?
Yeah, so that was intentional. And that's because when you think about pulling out like an 8x8x5 patch, that 5 is on the time axis. And so those 5 years need to be contiguous. So when we're splitting data into different periods of time for training, I want to be able to slice out patches that are contiguous in time in that region.
Can you remind me why it is by 5?
I tested it from 1 to 10 and performance plateaued at 5. So I just went with 5. Yeah.
Maybe related to that. So when you mentioned about the full shuffling, the spatial shuffling, right?
Yeah.
It's like you have these data points that are contiguous in time, but also space. And I assume that 8x8 is space. Yeah. So what was the logic there? Because like presumably you have spatial autocorrelation as well. So that don't you lose that with the shuffling?
Yeah, I see what you mean. So when we do sort of classical machine learning, you might think of this as sort of a pixel by pixel problem. Whereas in the deep learning approach, we're taking an 8x8 patch and trying to predict what the next 8x8 patch will look like. So within that patch, we want to capture all the spatial autocorrelation. Whereas when we're assembling many patches together, to pass to the model all at once, we don't want spatial autocorrelation. We want all those patches to come from like separate areas. And that was kind of why that shuffling step is necessary. Does that make sense?
It does, but that's kind of my question, like, how do you not lose spatial autocorrelation? Like, is your assumption that spatial autocorrelation only occurs in this 8x8 patches and you don't care what goes on further out?
Yeah, so there is some evidence. There isn't a whole lot of evidence of just kind of like how autocorrelated are these data at different like timescales. I made some semi-variograms from this sort of thing, and it does start plateauing at maybe around like 50 kilometers or so. And so if you figure an 8x8 patch, each pixel is 4 kilometers. So you're looking at a range of 32 kilometers. You're probably capturing most of it. The the patch size is sort of bounded on the lower end by getting as much spatial autocorrelation as you can, and bounded on the higher end by making sure you can still get enough patches, because as the patch becomes larger and larger, it's harder to find one that's not all missing in the data. So 8x8 is kind of an arbitrary choice here. It's one that, in my estimation, seemed to satisfy both of those objectives. Yeah, Helen?
Do the patches like overlap, or are you assuming that each patch is like independent of other patches?
They overlapped in this case. I mean, that's just another thing I have to try. It shouldn't matter if the patches overlap in space, because we care about generalizing the model in time. So I'm okay with overfitting to space. I'm not going to run this in any different geographic location. In that sense, then I don't think it matters if they overlap. There is some pseudo replication going on there. Yeah, that's another thing to try. Yeah.
Can you go back to the slide explaining like what recurrence was? And
Yeah. Ooh, this
Yeah.
is a hard question.
yeah, because I get the convolution. You're taking a larger and trying to make it smaller, but what can you explain what's happening in recurrence again, and like the scale?
Yeah, so the way to think about this is that if our output is an 8x8 patch, the model will maintain an internal hidden state that, in this particular like what it literally is an 8x8 by 8 array. That last access is referred to as like a channel dimension, and that's just kind of like a latent axis that isn't like, it's not related to like any physical axis. The idea of a recurrent model is that every time you pass a time step in, you're modifying that 8x8 cube, and then every time step it gets tweaked a little bit. So you might think of it as like, the analogy here is that somewhere in that 8x8 cube, you have like a forest health, sort of just like value or axis or something like that. And then each time you pass a time step through, that sort of latent variable gets updated, such that when you then spit out the last time step, you've been tracking that phenomenon, and now your model can make a prediction that is like incorporating the time dependence of that feature. There's some other stuff that the LSTM architecture does. In particular, it has like it's referred to as like a forget gate in the literature that kind of allows for that time dependence to happen. Yeah, without getting into like all the linear algebra of how all this works, like I'm trying to keep it fairly general, but does that answer your question? Kind of a little bit more about like what recurrence does? Okay, yeah.
Thank you.
Really good questions. Thank you. Yeah. Okay.
Idea of kind of like separate different insects outbreak is I would say it's gonna be, I'm not also like better, but it's gonna add more like explanation to
Yeah.
where the insects induced mortality happens. Because I guess insects outbreak did ask for different temperature precipitation.
Yeah. There was a paper that just came out doing this forecasting work with GAMS, and they separated all their data out by insects, and they got very, very different results depending on what insect they were looking at. Some of them, like, they just had no predictive capacity whatsoever. And then For others, in particular, the generalists, like the Western pine beetle and the mountain pine beetle, that's where they have the most success.
Cool, any other questions? No, well, let's give it another round.
Thank you.
So yeah, thank you everybody for coming, and we'll see you hopefully next week. We're hearing from Matthew Helmus on enhancing invasive